December 7, 1941. The Japanese strike on Pearl Harbor stunned the world and pulled the United States into the Second World War. But what drove Japan to launch such a daring attack against a powerful rival? And how was it linked to the conflict in China? To answer that, we must look back to 1939 and the continuing Sino-Japanese War. By then, Japan's swift conquest across China had slowed dramatically. In 1937, Japanese forces advanced an average of 29 kilometers per day. By 1939, that figure had dropped to less than 1. Even more troubling, new players were emerging in Asia's complex struggle. In May 1939, Japanese and Soviet troops clashed along the disputed border near Khalkhin Gol in Mongolia. What began as a minor skirmish escalated into a major confrontation, the fiercest between the two regional powers to that point. Under General Georgy Zhukov, Soviet forces inflicted a crushing defeat on Japan. The setback damaged Japan's confidence and revived fears of a Soviet invasion of its territories in Manchuria. Meanwhile, Chinese leader Chiang Kai-shek hoped Moscow might finally intervene against Japan. But diplomatic events soon altered the situation. On August 24, 1939, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union shocked the world by signing the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. The agreement deepened Japan's anxiety about a Soviet threat while dashing Chiang's hopes for Soviet support, since Germany would oppose any Soviet strike on Japan. Chiang's fears proved accurate. The pact ended the Khalkhin Gol fighting, and the Soviet Union redirected its attention toward Poland, which it secretly agreed to divide with Germany. The outbreak of war in Europe that September sparked mixed feelings in Japan. Some militarists admired Germany's rapid victories, while cautious politicians feared entanglement in another war. Divisions began to form within the Japanese leadership. Amid rising global tensions, Tokyo sought a way to conclude its costly campaign in China. Although Japan still captured new territory, taking Nanchang in May and Nanning in November 1939, these victories brought no end in sight. The army remained overextended and burdened with vast occupied lands. For Chiang Kai-shek, however, the European war presented a diplomatic opening. If he could frame China's struggle as part of a wider world conflict, he might gain more international backing. Frankly speaking, our purpose in resisting Japanese aggression is to have the war ended with the war in Europe and the World War at the same time. The Sino-Japanese problem is not simply the problem between China and Japan. It is a problem of the whole, of East Asia and also of the whole world. Chiang aimed to rally global support for his nationalist forces. Since Japan's invasion in 1937, China had drawn sympathy, especially from Britain and the United States, and nationalist officials worked hard to promote their cause through Western journalists and scholars. Crucially, they also depended on foreign aid for heavy weapons. After Hitler halted German arms shipments in 1938, the Soviet Union became China's main supplier, arming 20 divisions before scaling back after the Nazi-Soviet pact. Britain, France, and the U.S. then filled the gap. Though London and Paris focused on Europe, they still routed supplies to China via French Indochina and the Burma Road. In September 1939, U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt arranged a $25 million private loan for Chiang's arms purchases, while many Americans also donated. Former U.S. Air Corps officer Claire Lee Chennault helped organize China's Air Force and later formed the American volunteer group, the Flying Tigers, which would see combat in 1941. Yet, logistics were difficult. The Burma Road was perilous, slow, and rife with corruption, and total aid remained limited. By 1941, Washington had shipped 821,000 tons of material to Britain, but only 16,000 to China. Maintaining this lifeline was a political struggle for Chiang. He needed to appear strong and united to keep foreign aid flowing. So he launched a series of counteroffensives in the winter of 1939 with nearly 500,000 troops. Despite the effort, the offensives faltered, exposing weak coordination, though they did halt Japan's advance from Nanning and showed China was still resisting. Then came new setbacks in 1940. Germany's invasion of France diverted global attention, while Japan tightened its grip on China's supply lines. That July, Prince Fumimaro Konoe became Japan's prime minister. Facing economic hardship and food shortages, his government looked to exploit China's resources. But to do that, it needed to crush a China sustained by foreign aid. One key route was the Haiphong-Yunnan Railway through French Indochina. In September 1940, Japanese troops moved into northern Indochina after the Vichy French refused to cut the railway or allow Japanese transit. Following brief clashes, Vichy authorities yielded, signing an agreement that met Japan's demands. Though the move was made without approval from Tokyo, the government endorsed it afterward. Japanese diplomats also pressured Britain to close the Burma Road temporarily, further isolating China. However, these aggressive moves provoked the United States. After Japan's occupation of Indochina, President Roosevelt introduced America's first peacetime draft and imposed initial sanctions, limiting exports of scrap metal and aviation fuel. Rising hostility between Japan and the U.S. pushed Tokyo closer to the Axis powers. In September 1940, Japan joined Germany and Italy in the Tripartite Pact, a defensive alliance primarily aimed at deterring American intervention. The decision to join the Tripartite Pact was far from unanimous. Senior Japanese naval officers feared that an alliance with Germany would only heighten the risk of war with the United States. Meanwhile, Chiang Kai-shek faced growing troubles at home. The fragile Chinese United Front, which formerly united Chiang's nationalists with Mao Zedong's communists, was beginning to fracture. By mid-1940, Mao cautioned his commanders against trusting Chiang. You should not have any further false hope about the nationalists. Do not rely on them to help you with anything. If you end up being attacked by the nationalists on one side and the Japanese on the other, it will be extremely dangerous for you. By August 1940, the Communist Eighth Route Army had expanded to around 200,000 soldiers, possibly as many as 500,000 when including militia and support units. With these forces, the Communists launched the 100 Regiments Offensive, one of their few large-scale conventional operations of the war. Over 100 regiments struck Japanese and collaborationist targets across northern China. Although they failed to reclaim major cities, the campaign inflicted 30,000 to 40,000 casualties and severely damaged Japan's railways and communications. The Japanese retaliated brutally. Their counteroffensive included poison gas attacks and savage reprisals against civilians. General Yasuji Okamura soon implemented the infamous three-alls policy: kill all, burn all, loot all. Despite fighting the Japanese, Mao's growing influence alarmed Chiang. In January 1941, nationalist and communist forces clashed along the front, separating their zones. Historians still debate who fired first, but after intense fighting, nationalist troops prevailed. The United Front survived on paper, yet in practice it had collapsed. Meanwhile, in Europe, Nazi Germany's momentum seemed unstoppable. These developments, fears of geopolitical isolation and the lure of expansion, reshaped Japan's grand strategy. It's important to note that Tokyo's civilian government had limited authority over its own military, particularly the army in China. Military ministers wielded immense power and could effectively veto government policy. Under Prime Minister Prince Konoe and War Minister Hideki Tojo, the army's dominance grew even stronger. Foreign Minister Yosuke Matsuoka, who supported the Tripartite Pact, later admitted the truth. The army is the playwright of the pact, and I am a mere actor. While naval officers worried about provoking the United States, the army remained focused on China and the Soviet Union. In April 1941, Japan signed a 5-year neutrality pact with the USSR, a move designed to secure its northern flank while continuing the war in China. The agreement also freed up troops for operations elsewhere. Japanese strategists had long eyed Southeast Asia, particularly the European and American colonies in Malaya, Sarawak, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies. These territories, rich in oil, rubber, and other vital resources, were now vulnerable as their colonial rulers were preoccupied with the war in Europe. Capturing them through a strike south strategy would both secure Japan's resource needs and project an image of leading a new Asia for Asians empire, free from Western domination. Yet the Navy remained cautious, aware of America's industrial might. In June 1940, the United States announced plans to expand its naval tonnage by 70% within 8 years, approving the construction of 257 new ships at a cost equivalent to $131 billion today. Japan simply couldn't compete. Naval planners concluded that December 1941 would be the last moment Japan could strike before losing any chance of parity. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto warned urgently, "We must strike the U.S. fleet a blow at the initial stage and afterwards destroy each fleet as it sets out, to keep the Americans from rising to their feet. Otherwise, Japan, with its inferior national strength, will be increasingly at a disadvantage as time goes by." Even within the Navy, opinions were divided. Veterans familiar with American strength feared war would end disastrously, but younger officers were inspired by Germany's triumphs and sought expansion. The German invasion of the USSR in June 1941 only fueled their ambition, with Britain, France, the Netherlands, and the Soviet Union all weakened or distracted. One Japanese leader declared, "This is a golden opportunity that comes once in 1,000 years." These younger officers, known as Bakurio, or officers behind the curtain, held disproportionate influence. They pressured superiors, ignored orders, and used intimidation to shape policy, often without consequence. Meanwhile, as Japan's campaign in China stalled, many sought glory and promotion through new conquests. In July 1941, Japan completed its occupation of southern Indochina. To Washington, this confirmed Japan's intent to expand further. Anti-Japanese sentiment in the U.S. grew rapidly, prompting President Roosevelt to impose new sanctions, freezing Japanese assets and cutting off oil exports. As 80% of Japan's oil came from the United States, this dealt a devastating blow to its economy and military logistics. Japanese leaders estimated their reserves would last only 2 years. Thus, as German forces advanced toward Moscow, Japanese leaders debated their next move in the Pacific. Despite some internal hesitation, failures in China, U.S. embargoes, and mounting pressure from aggressive junior officers pushed Japan toward a fateful decision. Following the announcement of U.S. sanctions, the Japanese cabinet convened an emergency meeting. The outcome would set the stage for one of the most consequential military operations in modern history. Changing situation. Though not yet an outright decision for war, this marked the first time Southern expansion appeared in an official government directive. Our empire will continue its efforts to resolve the China incident and seek to establish a solid foundation for the nation's security and preservation. This will require taking steps to advance south. Frank 185. Japanese leaders had been discussing southern expansion for decades, but earlier plans avoided direct provocation of foreign powers. By August 1941, however, military strategists began drafting detailed operations against neutral Thailand, British-controlled Burma, Malaya, Singapore, Sarawak, Borneo, and Hong Kong, the U.S.-held Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies, New Guinea, and several Pacific islands. At another meeting in September, the emperor's unexpected intervention startled ministers. Breaking his usual silence, Emperor Hirohito read a poem calling for world peace and urged renewed diplomacy. Yet talks were already deadlocked. U.S. Secretary of State Cordell Hull demanded Japan withdraw entirely from China and Indochina as a precondition for any deal. President Roosevelt, meanwhile, refused to abandon Chiang Kai-shek, viewing Chinese resistance as vital to the global struggle. A Chinese collapse, Washington feared, could endanger the Soviet Union and invite a Japanese stab in the back, despite the neutrality pact between Tokyo and Moscow. Although Prime Minister Prince Konoe considered withdrawal, War Minister Hideki Tojo vehemently opposed it, pressing instead for armed confrontation with the United States. In mid-October, Konoe tried once more to dissuade Tojo from war, but Tojo insisted, "We can't bow to England and the United States. We've lost 160,000 lives already in the China incident. If we continue talking, we'll lose our opportunity to fight. We're wasting valuable time for operations." Dorn 388. With the impasse unbroken, Konoe resigned, and Tojo assumed both the posts of Prime Minister and War Minister. Japan's path toward war was now virtually assured. On November 1st, After a grueling 17-hour meeting, Navy Minister Shigetaro Shimada finally endorsed the Southern Strike. Tojo privately decreed that negotiations would end on December 1st, immediately followed by military action. Later that month, Hull presented Japan with a final proposal: withdraw from China and Indochina in exchange for restored trade and the unfreezing of Japanese assets. Though it lacked a deadline, Tojo saw it as an insulting ultimatum. On December 1st, at an imperial conference, Tojo reaffirmed the necessity of swift war. Emperor Hirohito listened in silence, then departed, signaling tacit consent. American intelligence had intercepted diplomatic communications suggesting an imminent attack, but could not determine its location or timing. In reality, a Japanese task force of 6 aircraft carriers, 2 battleships, and 17 support vessels was already en route across the Pacific, its target, the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor. The causes behind Japan's assault on Pearl Harbor remain a subject of debate among Western, Chinese, and Japanese historians. Many Japanese still argue U.S. sanctions provoked the attack, while most non-Japanese scholars maintain those sanctions were reactions to Japanese aggression already in motion. But why did Japan feel compelled to expand southward? Here, too, opinions diverge. Traditionally, particularly among post-war Western historians, Japan was accused of pursuing expansion to satisfy militarist ambition among both elites and the masses. Inspired by Nazi Germany, Japan sought to establish a Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, expelling Western powers from the Pacific and asserting itself as Asia's dominant force. While such visions primarily encompassed China, Southeast Asia, and India, some extremists even dreamed of puppet regimes stretching to Australia, the Americas, and the Caribbean, though few Japanese leaders deemed this realistic. Frank Dorn, a U.S.-China specialist and former advisor to Chiang, argued Japan followed a path of naked aggrandizement bound to collide with American ideals and interests in Asia. Imperial dreams certainly motivated some, especially the younger, fervent officer class, but many scholars contend empire building was not the primary goal of Japan's senior leadership. According to this interpretation, a Pan-Asian empire was a consequence, not the objective, of Southern expansion. Historians like Sarah Payne argue that China always remained central. Southern expansion aimed less at conquest and more at securing the vital resources needed to win the protracted Sino-Japanese War, a necessity that grew as Japanese offensives in China faltered. In 1941, the conflict was draining Japan far beyond expectation, and leaders sought compensation elsewhere. They entertained negotiations only within limits. Withdrawal from China, particularly Manchuria, was never an option. At the same time, the U.S. refused to abandon China, seeing it as a crucial front in the global war. Japan, meanwhile, could not realistically join Germany in attacking the Soviet Union while bogged down in China. Senior naval officers correctly warned that war with the U.S. would be catastrophic, but they were overruled by Tojo and the more dominant Army command. Unlike the Navy, who assessed the U.S. by industrial output, fleet size, and logistics, the Army relied on abstract notions of Japanese fighting spirit and assumed that Asian populations would rise against Western colonial powers in Japan's favor. On nearly every count, these assumptions proved wrong. Instead of ending the Second Sino-Japanese War, the Pearl Harbor attack bound it irrevocably to the Second World War. Both conflicts would end only in 1945, after Japan's surrender following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The brief alliance between the Chinese Communist Party and Kuomintang collapsed once more, ushering in the Cold War and a new nuclear age. Joseph Stalin, in particular, accelerated the Soviet atomic program to achieve nuclear-powered communism and develop nuclear weapons. To explore that story, our new series Red Atoms traces the Soviet bomb's origins through the Chernobyl disaster and beyond, available on Nebula, the streaming platform we built with other creators. On Nebula, we're free from algorithms and ad restrictions, directly supported by viewers like you. This lets us create projects such as Red Atoms or our W. Wood documentaries, 16 Days in Berlin and Rhineland. 45. Beyond documentaries, Nebula now offers classes where you can learn directly from creators. In our latest, I walk you through the full production process of a real-time history episode, from script to screen. Sign up at nebula.tv Real-Time History for 40% off an annual subscription. Just $30 for ad-free early access to our entire catalog, exclusive series, and creator classes. And if you'd like to go further, Nebula's lifetime membership this December directly supports us and funds more original historical documentaries we couldn't make on YouTube. All sources for this episode are listed in the video description. If you're watching on Patreon or Nebula, thank you for your support. I'm Jesse Alexander, and this has been a production of Real-Time History, the only history channel pursuing a policy of naked aggrandizement.